Here's a startling fact. In the 45 years since the introduction of the automated teller machine, those vending machines that dispense cash, the number of human bank tellers employed in the United States has roughly doubled. What are all those tellers doing? And why hasn't automation eliminated their employment by now? If you think about it, many of the great inventions of the last 200 years were designed to replace human labor. Tractors were developed to substitute mechanical power for human physical toil. Computers were programmed to swap out error-prone, inconsistent human calculation with digital perfection. These inventions have worked. We no longer dig ditches by hand or do bookkeeping using actual books. And yet, the fraction of US adults employed in the labor market is higher now in 2016 than it was 125 years ago in 1890, and it's risen in just about every decade in the intervening 125 years. This poses a paradox. Our machines increasingly do our work for us. Why doesn't this make our labor redundant and our skills obsolete? Why are there still so many jobs? ATMs, automated teller machines, had two countervailing effects on bank teller employment. As you'd expect, they replaced a lot of teller tasks. The number of tellers per branch fell by about a third. But banks quickly discovered it also was cheaper to open new branches, and the number of bank branches increased by about 40% in the same time period. The net result was more branches and more tellers. But those tellers were doing somewhat different work. As their routine cash handling tasks receded, they became less like checkout clerks and more like salespeople, forging relationships with customers, solving problems, and introducing them to new products like credit cards, loans, and investments. More tellers doing a more cognitively demanding job. There's a general principle here. Most of the work that we do requires a multiplicity of skills. Automating some subset of those tasks doesn't make the other ones unnecessary. In fact, it makes them more important. It increases their economic value. Let me give you a stark example. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded and crashed back down to Earth less than 2 minutes after takeoff. The cause of that crash, it turned out, was an inexpensive rubber O-ring in the booster rocket that had frozen on the launch pad the night before and failed catastrophically moments after takeoff. In this multi-billion-dollar enterprise, that simple rubber O-ring made the difference between mission success and the calamitous death of 7 astronauts. An ingenious metaphor for this tragic setting is the O-ring production function. The O-ring production function conceives of work as a series of interlocking steps, links in a chain. Every one of those links must hold for the mission to succeed. This precarious situation has a surprisingly positive implication. Improvements in the reliability of any one link in the chain increases the value of improving any of the other links. The reason the O-ring was critical to Space Shuttle Challenger is because everything else worked perfectly. Here's the broader point. In much of the work that we do, we are the O-rings. Yes, ATMs could do certain cash handling tasks faster and better than tellers. But that didn't make tellers superfluous. It increased the importance of their problem-solving skills and their relationships with customers. Now, as our tools improve, technology magnifies our leverage and increases the importance of our expertise and our judgment and our creativity. And that brings me to the second principle. Never get enough. You may be thinking, okay, O-ring, got it. That says the jobs that people do will be important. They can't be done by machines, but they still need to be done. But that doesn't tell me how many jobs there'll need to be. In 1900, 40% of all US employment was on farms. Today, it's less than 2%. Why are there so few farmers today? It's not because we're eating less. A century of productivity growth in farming means that now a couple of million farmers can feed a nation of 320 million. That's amazing progress, but it also means there are only so many O-ring jobs left in farming. Many of the industries in which we now work, health and medicine, electronics and computing, were tiny or barely existed a century ago. Many of the products that we spend a lot of our money on, air conditioners, sport utility vehicles, computers, and mobile devices, were unattainably expensive or just hadn't been invented a century ago. As automation frees our time and increases the scope of what is possible, we invent new products, new ideas, new services that command our attention, occupy our time, and spur consumption. You may think some of these things are frivolous. Extreme yoga, adventure tourism, Pokemon Go, and I might agree with you. But people desire these things and they're willing to work hard for them, to harvest the technological bounty that is available to them. So if you accept these two principles, the O-ring principle and the never get enough principle, then you agree with me. There will be jobs. Does that mean there's nothing to worry about? No. Automation creates wealth by allowing us to do more work in less time. There's no economic law that says that we will use that wealth well, and that is worth worrying about. Consider two countries, Norway and Saudi Arabia, both oil-rich nations. It's like they have money spurting out of a hole in the ground. But they haven't used that wealth equally well to foster human prosperity, human prospering. Norway is a thriving democracy. By and large, its citizens work and play well together. It's typically numbered between first and fourth in rankings of national happiness. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy in which many citizens lack a path for personal advancement. It's typically ranked 35th among nations in happiness, which is low for such a wealthy nation. The difference between these two countries is not their wealth and it's not their technology, it's their institutions. Norway has invested to build a society with opportunity and economic mobility. Saudi Arabia has raised living standards while frustrating many other human strivings. Two countries, both wealthy, not equally well off. And this brings me to the challenge that we face today, the challenge that automation poses for us. The challenge is not that we're running out of work. The US has added 14 million jobs since the depths of the Great Recession. The challenge is that many of those jobs are not good jobs, and many citizens cannot qualify for the good jobs that are being created. But here's some encouraging news. We have faced equally momentous economic transformations in the past, and we have come through them successfully. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, when automation was eliminating vast numbers of agricultural jobs, remember that tractor? The farm states faced the threat of mass unemployment, a generation of youth no longer needed on the farm, but not prepared for industry. Rising to this challenge, they took the radical step of requiring that their entire youth population remain in school. This was called the high school movement, and it was a radically expensive thing to do. Not only did they have to invest in the schools, but those kids couldn't work at their jobs. It also turned out to be one of the best investments the US made in the 20th century. It gave us the most skilled, the most flexible, and the most productive workforce in the world. What this example highlights is the primacy of our institutions, most especially our schools, in allowing us to reap the harvest of our technological prosperity. It's foolish to say there's nothing to worry about. Clearly, we can get this wrong. If the US had not invested in its schools and in its skills a century ago with the high school movement, we would be a less prosperous, a less mobile, and probably a lot less happy society. Adjusting to the rapid pace of technological change creates real challenges, seen most clearly in our polarized labor market and the threat that it poses to economic mobility. I can't tell you what people are going to do for work 100 years from now, but the future doesn't hinge on my imagination. If I were a farmer in Iowa in the year 1900, an economist from the 21st century teleported down to my field and said, in the next 100 years, agricultural employment is going to fall from 40% of all jobs to 2%. I would not have said, oh, we got this. We'll do app development, radiological medicine, yoga instruction, Bitmoji. Wow, a 95% reduction in farm employment with no shortage of food. That's an amazing amount of progress. I hope that humanity finds something remarkable to do with all of that prosperity. Thank you very much.